So let's start by looking at Chapter 5 and having you make a list of all the words that are gender specific that come to your mind. What types of things come to your mind when we say that? Trucks, are those masculine or feminine? Jewelry, is that masculine or feminine? Pink, blue, athletic, buff. All of these words have different gender connotations that we have learned throughout living in American society. So let's take a look at how did we learn those? What types of language are we going to study in order to look at how gender is language specific? First of all, we're going to look at male generic language. When we talk about male generic language, what we are looking at is using what we call a generic he. Using a generic he indicates that everybody can be referred to as he or him or man. And there is little thought given to what does the society value when we do this. So it leads us to assume only men are included. But the other thing it leads us to assume is that women can't participate in these behaviors. So by saying postman, does that imply that a woman cannot deliver mail? And we know that it does because we then carry it one step further and we apply gender specific thinking to different types of terms, and we see things like spotlighting take place to counteract it. So in American society, for a long time, it was assumed that if someone was a doctor, it had to be a man. So we often heard people starting to spotlight and say, I'm going to a female doctor, I'm going to a lady doctor. And they spotlight the word lady because the natural inclination is that it would be a man, unless it's spotlighted. So let's take a look at some other spotlighting we do. One of the things that we used to say is we used to say stewardess. Automatically assumed that if you were being taken care of by someone on an airplane, it was going to be a woman. Now we use the word flight attendant. But for the time in between the use of the word flight attendant and the previous use of stewardess, we would say, I had a male, etc., whatever the next word was going to be. And we use this male spotlighting for any places where a man was working in a position of caretaking of another human being. A male nurse, for example, would be another example of spotlighting. Why do we see this happen? Well, because women are often referred to by their appearance or their relationship to others. We also see that men are often defined by their activities, their accomplishments, or their positions. And if you question the validity of this, let's take a look at the last Olympic Games and how the media covered the men. Michael Phelps, as one of the top swimmers for the United States, was consistently profiled according to his swimming abilities and his past performance. The female counterparts, however, were featured on the front pages of multiple magazines in bikinis, flaunting their bodies rather than their achievements. We see this as being one way in which the way that we talk about people, being the media talking about them in these articles, indicates a societal norm as well as a value judgment. So let's take a look at parallel words. If you look at page 119 in your textbook, we start to look at what some of these parallel words are. For example, what is the masculine parallel to slut? We don't really have one. What is the masculine parallel to housewife? We don't really have one. When we indicate that certain behaviors only exist for one gender, we place a societal connotation on that behavior. We indicate its importance. We indicate its function. And when it doesn't exist for both sexes, it tells us something about the society at large. Another example of that is, what words do we actually have? So we can look at the words that we use. We can look at the way that we use those words. And then we can look at the things we actually don't have a word for, or where we have multiple words. Is it different when I say a politician was involved in a sex scandal than if I say they're a rapist? Of course it is. We lower the negative connotation by using the word sex scandal. When we see articles in the paper about rape and it refers to it as sexual abuse. All of these things that minimize the experience of someone by the words that we choose. So let's look at a class discussion on this. Currently, in your discussions on D2L, you are talking about how important is the name. Should you take the last name of your husband if you are a woman? Men, should your wives take your name upon marriage? What do you think? Go ahead and take time to log in to your discussion questions and answer these according to what does it really tell us about our society at large and how important is it. When we talk about language not being static, what we mean is that language is constantly changing. And so we see words that have changed over time. Sexual harassment, for example, is a word that didn't even exist at one point in our history because if we didn't acknowledge the behavior as negative, we had no reason to have the word harassment follow it. The other word that we didn't have was date rape. It was presumed if you had sex on a date, it couldn't possibly be rape. Therefore, we didn't have a need for that word. And if we look again at some of those parallels of men and women, women still has men issued inside of its word. Stud versus slut. What are the connotations, negative or positive? Player versus easy. Again, who do we use these words to pertain to and what do they tell us? What is the societal judgment on men and women indicated through those last three parallels? When we move from talking about that to looking at what can we learn from it, we see that language really does tell us a lot about our society. It expresses our cultural views. Male generic language excludes women. It defines men and women differently. It shapes our awareness of gender issues, whether we say rape, whether we say sexual harassment, whether we say sexual abuse or sex scandal. Language organizes our perceptions of gender. It evaluates and it allows us for self-reflection. So let's look at how it organizes our perceptions. It organizes our perceptions into stereotypes. If I say to you, what are masculine behaviors? You're going to be able to list them for me. If I ask you for feminine behaviors, you're going to list them for me. You have words for both of those behaviors, and those words encourage stereotyping and polarized thinking, as though you have to be one or the other because we do not have a word that accomplishes both. Second, it evaluates gender. Let's look at some of the words we use to talk about women. We talk about them as food. Oh, she's a cupcake. Oh, isn't she sweet? Oh, I could eat her up. Oh, she's good enough to eat. We see that sugar, honey, all of these terms of endearment are only used for women, equating them with an object like food. The other thing that we do is we trivialize women by using words that refer to them that are immature or juvenile. We call them baby doll, princess, girl, and often we use these words for full-grown women. Based on those words, we start to evaluate ourselves. We reflect based on societal definitions. And then these reflections are enhanced as we look at the celebrity culture. Celebrity culture indicates that all of these things are true, where we strive for a thinness and a beauty that doesn't exist in real society. What's interesting is, if you look at page 124 in Gendered Lives, you'll see that androgynous people, those who do not subscribe to either modes of masculine or feminine behaviors or thinking all of the time, they don't buy into that polarized model that they have to be one or the other, are actually more successful. And probably they're more successful because they evaluate themselves on a different set of standards. What we do know about people is that most of us subscribe to either being masculine or feminine. And based on that choice or that decision or that learned behavior, we end up in one of the two speech communities. A speech community is a group of people that share understandings about goals of communication, strategies for enacting those goals, and ways of interpreting the communication that takes place. Men and women are socialized into masculine and feminine speech communities. So let's look at how that happens. We see that as children, women are put into participate with other girls in their conversations. Girls tend to play in small groups or pairs. They spend more time talking than doing anything else, and they often engage in more cooperative play. Their male counterparts, however, participate in more competitive play, have games that take place in larger groups, and most often the games that they participate in involve rules and goals and roles. So let's look at what that leads to. It leads us to what we call feminine speech. When we talk about feminine speech communities, we see a group of people where talk is essential to the relationship. Equality is essential to the relationships and the communication taking place. We see that efforts are made to sustain conversations, responsive gestures are engaged, talk is personal and concrete, and tentative communication is common. On the reverse, we see very different features in a masculine speech community, where establishing control and status is critical. Speech is used here to accomplish instrumental objectives. There's a goal, there's a purpose, there's a problem and a solution. Men often talk more and at greater length than women, which is much opposed to the societal stereotyping that women talk more. Men also tend to interrupt more than women. Look at page 130, you'll see a little bit more research on this topic. Speech is directive and assertive for men, often abstract, and very often not emotionally responsive in nature. What we know is that the way that we have raised our boys and men and the way we've raised our girls and women leads us into those masculine and feminine speech communities. So what I want you to do is that true for you? Think to yourself, what were your 3 favorite games to play as a child? Now that you've examined what those games were, take a minute to think about, do they fall into the traditional games of girls if you're a girl, and the traditional games of boys if you're a boy? Because we're raised in these 2 different speech communities in most cases, we often find that it leads to a lot of breakdown in communication. Women make and expect more listening noises or responsiveness in a conversation. Therefore, when they don't receive that, they assume a man is not listening or not caring about their level of conversation and what they're talking about. Often, on the reverse, men see sympathy as condescending. They don't want that type of support, so when it's exhibited to them, they feel put down by it, which is a response that women don't understand, since sympathy and empathy are very critical pieces of feminine speech communities. Masculine speech communities seek problem solving and assume directness, which is sometimes seen as critical or evaluative in nature by someone from a feminine speech community. And so when we see these troubles emerge amongst our talk, it's because masculine speech communities show support by assuming others don't need sympathy. They match experiences used in feminine communities to express empathy rather than to steal center stage, but women assume, or feminine speech community participants assume, it's meant to steal center stage. Emotions are not necessarily even deemed necessary to discuss in both communities to begin with. So what's the point of this story? Masculine speech communities tell stories in a linear fashion without many details, and they build up to the climax of the story. Those who participate in feminine speech communities focus on the process of communication. They talk just to talk. I give an interesting example. When we're meeting in the classroom setting to discuss this topic, one of the things I always tell my students is, if I say to my husband, let's go out for coffee and talk, his response is, what's wrong? Because if we're going to talk about a relationship, it must be there's a problem that needs to be solved. Whereas if I call my best girlfriend and I say, hey, do you want to go out for coffee and talk? She says, sure, let's go. That's because being raised in a feminine speech community, one of the things that we know is that women talk for the sake of talk. Those who've been raised in a masculine speech community talk in order to accomplish an objective or solve an issue. And when we look at these 2 differences, we see where communication issues often arise between people of both speech communities. Men only talk about relationships if there's a problem to address. Women, on the other hand, find it pleasurable to talk about relationships. This sums up to the difference between problem solving and engaging in the process of communication for its own sake as the ultimate goals of communication. In public speaking settings, we see even more differences arise. Men are viewed as assertive and dominant and confident. This is exhibited through both their verbal and nonverbal behavior. Women, on the other hand, if they engage in masculine characteristics, then they will be seen as successful. But women who traditionally engage in feminine speech community behavior are not seen as successful, nor are they seen as leaders in their own environments. So what I want you to do is to go online and find 2 to 3 newspaper articles. Note the extent to which men and women are represented differently in the articles. Is their marital status discussed? Is their appearance discussed? Is their family life discussed? You'll probably find if it's a feminine model, yes they are. In the men's versions of articles, do you see that their accomplishments are discussed? Do these articles support or deny the research that we've presented in Chapter 5?